This is a production of Cornell University.
I went to Bowling Green University in Ohio, and from that I had a choice of going to either Ohio State or Michigan. And in my family, we had divided loyalties. So I had some people who were Michigan graduates, some who were Ohio State graduates. Luckily, I made the right choice, wound up in Ann Arbor, and had an incredible education because I was in Ann Arbor when the social sciences there were in their glory. So the psychology, sociology, economics, history, political science, all those programs were top 10 programs back in the 1960s. And there was an incredible infusion of federal money for research on the social sciences, particularly at that time, urban stuff and crime, ethnic relations, race relations. So for a period of 4 years, I was not just taking sociology courses, but I also had a minor in social psychology. I took courses in math, took courses in political science. So I had a minor in political behavior. And it was and I had a course with George Katona, one of the leading lights in economic behavior. So it was 4 years in which I just had a feeling of I was on a constant learning journey. And it gave me an opportunity not just to meet very excellent professors, but also we ran research projects through the Institute for Social Research there. So I was a study director for a number of studies that were nationally representative samples, and so I got experience in actually designing surveys, coding surveys, working with coding crews, working with interviewing crews. And that meant that by the time I got to be a person ready to do my dissertation, I had the skills I needed to actually assemble my own crew. And so I did a study of what I called organizations in hostile environments, which meant going out to Boston, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. with my own people I'd hired as interviewers and put them up in YMCAs and other cheap motels. So it was just an incredible experience, compressing into those 4 years what many people spend 5 or 6 years in graduate school to accomplish, plus with a postdoc. And it was all possible through the fact that I had full support from a National Science Foundation and also a Danforth Foundation fellowship, and just fantastic resources. Yeah, I think a couple of points about where I am today. People actually don't realize that my early work was primarily urban social, urban ecology, small firms. So I mentioned already the dissertation was a study of 800 small businesses and small organizations in 3 cities, in the high crime areas of 3 cities. It was a 4-wave panel study. And later on, actually in the 1980s, when I began to meet people who were doing entrepreneurship research, and I talked about stuff I'd done early in my career back in the 60s and the 70s, I discovered retrospectively that I'd actually been studying entrepreneurship, by their definition, for decades. And so that period, the period from the late 60s to the early 70s, is when I did a 4-wave panel study of these businesses, and then subsequently had an opportunity to take that same design to the United Kingdom, and did the same thing from 1978 until 1984. We did a 4-wave panel study of 800 businesses in 3 English cities, Leicester, Bradford, and the Ealing area near Heathrow Airport in London. So those 2 projects collectively, in the aggregate, occupied me from the late 60s until actually the late 70s, 2 4-wave panel studies replicating this dynamic design. And so it gave me an opportunity to look at, to observe and to measure the volatility in the small business population. So one of the things of interest in these projects was that we were looking at areas that were undergoing really rapid ethnic succession. So in the case of the United States, these are areas in Roxbury in Boston, the west side in Chicago, the Georgia 7th Avenue corridor, 14th Street in Washington, D.C. Now, if I were telling you this back in the late 1960s, you'd immediately know that these were all areas that had substantial civil disorders in the late 60s. So we were studying small firms, representative samples actually, these were random samples, these weren't picked to be small, these were random samples of businesses. We were studying these businesses in environments that were incredibly challenging. So you had the population shifts as the suburbanization of these cities was underway. You had ethnic succession as the white populations were moving out, being replaced by African American and Hispanic populations. What was of interest to us, to me, as we got started, was that the business population was adapting as a population to these changes also. So specifically, when the turnover occurred of ownership in these businesses, previously the next people in the queue would have been other whites coming in. But because of these changes and because of the increasing proportion in these neighborhoods of African American residents, whites no longer found this as an attractive proposition. And so over time in these areas, first in the most heavily African American neighborhoods, and then gradually elsewhere as they changed more, the white owners were replaced. And it was this fantastic fantastic process. You just descriptively look at the 68, 70, 72, 74, and look at the proportion of whites versus the proportion of blacks, look at the new owners, what happens when a place becomes vacant, who takes it on. The great thing about this was we could relate this turnover in ownership to the turnover in the population. We coded down to the level of the census tract the racial composition of the neighborhoods. And so we knew in these very small areas, because we had 1960, 1970, we knew the rate of change. And we could relate the business population change to the population of the residential population. So in the 1970s, when I was here at Cornell doing research on a variety of things, I never lost interest in this business dynamics question. And I had an opportunity with my sabbatic to go to the United Kingdom. So I applied for a Ford Foundation grant. I described what I wanted to do. I said that I'd been reading about the UK, and I'd read they'd had some civil disorders in the 1960s. There was a lot of, not a lot of turmoil, but there's some objection in the UK to the immigration from the new Commonwealth areas, and particularly the Caribbean, where and then Pakistan and East Africa, they were getting many people who were either Pakistani, Indian, or Caribbean. And I said, well, it'll be really interesting to see whether in UK cities the turnover in the residential population is having an impact on the business population. And I proposed this to a center in London. And the first thing they said was, this is preposterous. You can't make an assumption that the relations between the races in the UK is anything like the rates. We don't have your problem in the US. This is a foolish endeavor. Don't bother us. Well, I'd been doing enough reading to realize that I thought they were wrong, and so I wrote back politely and I said, look, give me a chance to prove that you're right, or give me a chance to show you, let me see if we can put this onto an empirical test. So they relented, and I got a grant, spent half of the year in London, and began a pilot project. I did maybe 250 interviews in a part of area London called Wandsworth, which had a big Caribbean population, some Asian population. And lo and behold, it turned out that the concepts of succession, of the protected market, the fact that the people being served by some of these businesses were no longer, some of the owners no longer knew how to deal with their customers. That was sufficient to convince some of my friends and colleagues at Liverpool to join with me. We put an application in, and that application gave us the money to do a companion study. So we, as I said, I started in 76, 78, 80, 82, 3 English cities, and we did the interviews, and in that case we were able to code down to the level of 100 meter by 100 meter square areas the residential composition using voter registration lists. So we had this incredible micro data on the ecology of the environment of these businesses. We knew, and we had estimates from the people we talked to in our observations. We tried to estimate the Asian customers, because that's what we're mainly talking about, in some cases African American, or not African American, but Caribbean. So we were able to put together ultimately probably a portfolio of a dozen articles that came out of this. And I was able to go back to the people at the Center for Environmental Studies and say to them, maybe I was right. Not maybe I was right. I said I was right. That was the right thing to do. So that is an example of the kinds of research agenda that I'm following, which is I like to pick a project where I spend some time getting to know the lay of the land, get some idea of what kind of story might come out of this project, and then build a dynamic design so that it's. I abhor static cross-sectional research. It's anathema to me. My argument to my students is that you want to study something, you have to watch it change. So these projects that I mentioned already, these 2-4-wave massive projects, typically take a decade from beginning to getting the design going, collecting the data, and then the write-up. It takes, in fact, for the case of the United Kingdom study, I was writing papers in the 1980s from the project that began in the late 1970s and up until 1990 when Roger Waldinger and I did a book on this, Ethnic Entrepreneurs. So the research design that I like to use is a long-term dynamic design, one that permits me to continuously or measure with the same indicators over time some process, and then be able to describe and explain analytically why things have changed as they have.
Wonderful. Your career.
Yes, I like to say that I wish I could say that I deliberately chosen the strategy of coming to Cornell as my first job, because it did work out so well, but I have to say in retrospect that it was a fortuitous choice in several respects. There were several things going for Cornell when I got here. One of them was that Bill Starbuck was here, and he only overlapped with me for a couple of years, but with Bill and then with the other colleagues I had in the ILR school in the OB department, I realized that my research interests could be described not as just sociology and evolutionary thinking, but in terms of organizational studies, which is sociology. So I'd written a number of papers in graduate school that where I was trying to work out what evolutionary thinking was all about as applied to organizations. And so one of the first attempts I made, I sent to Bill Starbuck, and I actually submitted it to Administrative Science Quarterly, thinking, wow, here's an opportunity to get my work into this journal, which, I tell you the truth, I knew about ASQ, but I didn't realize what a reputation it had in the field until much later when I was associate editor. So I was very surprised. 2 weeks later came the manuscript back, unreviewed, with a letter from Bill saying something like, I know this is a form letter 2A. I learned this when I became associate editor. It's just form letter 2A. It said, "Dear sir, very sorry, we're not going to review this paper because it's off the main line of interest of our journal." Now, that was, I'm an entrepreneur, as my sons are, in the sense that you can't tell me I can't do something. That's probably the worst mistake you could make. If you tell me I can't do something, and that just incites me. So that paper was rewritten, something like interorganizational conflict and organizational boundaries, an evolutionary approach. And so that was my first actual paper. I reworked it, sent it to Human Relations, which was a very good UK journal. Got published in 1970-71. So as far as I know, that was and in that paper, I actually have an argument about a point I make in quoting the biological ecology literature to say that we can't investigate organizations without paying attention to the environments they inhabit. In fact, no explanations are complete until the explanation includes the environment in which the organization is acquiring its resources. And so that kind of became the stake in the ground for me, that early 1970s paper. I went on to do other things, but that really, the response to that paper made me realize that this was a general perspective. I had the good fortune to be exposed not only to the work of sociologists, but also people like Donald Campbell when I was at Michigan. So I knew and read about this variation, selection, retention approach. And I discovered, as I began working on my stuff in the 1970s, that this framework was a very powerful generic framework. It wasn't a detailed mechanism perspective, but once you understood the ideas of selection, selective retention, understood the ideas of variation, you could apply this to about anything. And that was a revelation to me. So then Carl Weick showed up here. So Bill Starbuck left and went off to other pastures. But Carl Weick showed up here, and Carl at that point he just published a few years before his book called The Social Psychology of Organizing. And Carl's book is organized around variation, selection, retention. So here I had on campus another person who also celebrated an evolutionary approach, but at a micro level. Carl was a psychologist, a social psychologist. So he and I would regularly get together, mainly through our students. We would share students, people who would be in my course and his course, people he would chair and I would be on their committees. So we didn't see eye to eye on it too much, it seemed, as we talked. But of course, looking back, I realized we had this incredible home we shared, which was an appreciation for evolutionary thinking. And that appreciation then turned up in all the subsequent work that I did. So while I was here at Cornell, the other important part that led to the 1979 book, the Organizations and Environments book, was that I got really interested in world systems theory through one of my, I became a good friend, Jane Weiss, who was a Stanford graduate. She'd been working with Mike Hannon, so there was an indirect connection to the West Coast. I spent a summer in 1973 teaching as one of the first NIH fellows for Dick Scott in his Organizations and Institutions program. So the Stanford connection was very strong early on, and also an appreciation through Jane of world systems theory. So down the road in Binghamton, Emanuel Wallerstein had set up shop, and I had some interaction with him, and on campus there were some of his disciples in a sense. So I offered a course. It's unbelievable. You realize I had no training in this necessarily. I offered a course in world systems theory in the ILR school. I did it on a chance that there'd be people interested, and it turned out there were. I had some of Wallerstein's students come in. I think Manny came in once to teach in that class. And that world systems perspective then became something that finally completed the levels of analysis that I was working toward. So I now had, with Carl, I had the micro level. With the sociology I had at University of Michigan, I had the organizational level, and now with the world systems perspective and some of the ecology perspective, I had a community and a global perspective on things. So I spent 1977, 1978 working on the draft of the book, which came out in December 78, January 79, Organizations and Environments, and that book was pretty much the first statement, the first book-length statement of this perspective, not just thinking in evolutionary terms, but also a multiple level, thinking about issues of selection, thinking about the politics. And in fact, fast forward to 2012, looking back at that book now, I realized the other perspective I was working on, but I didn't really emphasize, was resource dependence. So if you look at that 1979 book, you do see the evolutionary argument, you see the argument about levels of analysis, but you also see a lot of emphasis on power, on politics, on dominance, on governance, on the way in which two parties in a relationship are jockeying for position strategically, and the dynamics of that relationship are the resource dependence dynamics. And that happened in part because another one of my Stanford connections in the 1970s was Jeff Pfeffer. When I spent that summer in Stanford, Jeff and I hooked up and went on to work on the first synthetic statement combining an evolutionary perspective and a resource dependence perspective. That's still one of my most cited papers, published in 1976 in the Annual Review of Sociology. And in that interaction with Jeff, I was able to see that really it made no sense to talk about resource dependence or evolutionary theory as two separate ways of looking at the world, but rather they could be combined. And so even though the book, the 1979 book and my subsequent work tends to be seen as evolutionary, the actual micro mechanisms, the explanations for how things actually happen between people in organizations and between organizations, they're very much about power dynamics and about exchange dynamics. So Jeff and Jerry Zelanzik, who was ultimately one of the associate editors with me at ASQ, Jeff and Jerry went on to write The External Control of Organizations, a very well-known book, probably Jeff's still most cited work. That was published in 1978, and my book was published in 1979. So here you had these two statements people could look to, and unfortunately, because Jeff and Jerry tended to emphasize, want to downplay evolutionary thinking, there's some selection logic in there. And I tended to be seen as somebody who was associated with ecology, or at that time it was called population ecology. I don't think people recognize that these were actually part of the same programmatic move in the organization studies community to get away from the old simple contingency view, the old rational choice view, to a more dynamic, political, evolutionary way of thinking. Again, like a lot of the things that I look back on with great amusement, my discovery that I was an entrepreneurship scholar happened because I went to by accident, went to a conference where I was at the last minute dragooned into doing a paper because the guy who was supposed to be there was sick. So I wrote a short paper called Entrepreneurship Through Social Networks. This is the mid-'80s. And that paper turned out to, for some reason, it's still cited today. The citations are growing, actually. That paper tended to get people really excited because it was a way of bringing networks into entrepreneurship and making the study of entrepreneurship more sociological. What I discovered at that conference and then subsequently is that there was a whole world out there of people studying entrepreneurship that I'd pretty much been isolated from because I was in the organization studies community, and entrepreneurship was not, let me tell you, a central issue for organizations people back in those days. If you looked at the leading textbooks, you looked at the leading papers, the very famous paper that DiMaggio and Powell wrote in 1983 about isomorphism, there's just no mention of entrepreneurs, the role of new organizations, new businesses, where variation comes from. So just to discover that all of a sudden out there are all these people, mainly in business schools, mainly with other training than sociology, was a revelation to me. So I began then I began going to these to meetings, to conferences. My research projects changed. I did a three-wave panel study in the research triangle of entrepreneurs. I got involved with Paul Reynolds in the mid-'90s in the panel study for entrepreneurial dynamics. Again, dragged reluctantly into it. I hadn't initially intended to get involved. Paul had asked me, but I saw that the chances to do this four-wave panel study were just too good to pass up. And of course, it wasn't coincidental that my earlier research projects that I'd favored were four-wave panel studies. So really starting in the mid-1980s, my research agenda, what I was doing, shifted from talking about business and change and organizational change to talking about entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial strategies, entrepreneurial activities, entrepreneurial variation, all those kinds of things subsequently. And part of that change you can see in my 1999 book, the first edition of Organizations Evolving. It was subsequently redone with Martin Ruth for the 2006 edition, but the 1999 edition, the first cut, you'll see that's organized, even though it's sold often as a trade book that's about organization theory, it's really about entrepreneurship. The sections are organized such that you start with the creation of organizations, their internal dynamics, the building of organizational boundaries, then you go to the level of organizational change at the organization and population level, and it winds up with the community level. And all through there also there's a discussion of networks. A lot of the ideas in that were crystallized by my work with Bill McKelvey. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention this, that we had a paper in Administrative Science Quarterly, 1983, where we worked out a lot of ideas about how you could use this variation selection retention scheme to create a comprehensive understanding of organizational change. So I quarried that paper substantially in the 1999 book. And then subsequently with Martin Ruth in the 2006 edition, we brought that argument up to date. The other thing that happened during this time was that I was able to recruit to Carolina some really excellent graduate students. So I mentioned to you earlier when we were talking about my work, about half of what I do, half of what I publish is empirical, about half of what I publish is conceptual, theoretical, and almost more than half of my work is co-authored. So over the years, I've been able to find people to work with who've substantially enriched my understanding. I can't say enough about the fact that if I'm talking to graduate students out there, how important good graduate students have been to my work, and also the networking I've been able to accomplish going to meetings, writing to people, making sure I track people down. I see that their interests are compatible with mine. So if you look at my work, certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, you'll see it's mostly teamwork, and it's with people whose skills are complementary to mine. And that particularly shows up, I think, in the PSED2 project. This is the panel study of entrepreneurial dynamics that we did as a follow-up to the earlier one and fixed some of the mistakes. So 2 papers in particular that come out of that showed this. One of them was the paper in ASR in the mid-2000s showing the way that entrepreneurial teams are put together is very homophilous, putting the lie to the argument that on a policy basis what you want to do is put together a team of complementary assets and people who are diverse in background. And what we were able to show with this wonderful data set, representative national sample of people trying to start businesses, is that in fact the businesses that emerge from this process are very homophilous. Age, sex, occupation, race, very homophilous. And then right now I have a really excellent graduate student, Tian Yang, working with me. We're looking at using PSED2 to answer questions of interest to sociologists about things like who gets to be the boss in these organizations. So really in the last 20 years, if I looked at something and I didn't at first see the entrepreneurial implications or angle, I just looked at it again, and eventually I could see somewhere in there's an entrepreneurial angle to be pursued. Yes, I want to thank my good friend Jerry Davis for giving me a real push into this. He is the one who got me to actually meet a near neighbor, Ted Hall, who's the founder of ShopBot. Jerry said to me, there's this guy over in Durham who's doing really interesting stuff. You ought to meet him. Because Jerry and I talked a little bit about my interest in technological revolution. And my oldest son is an entrepreneur, and his work has been at sort of high-tech stuff, and I'm always interested in that area, although most of the research I've done has been on representative samples. So I looked up what Ted Hall was doing, and it turned out to be the portal into this amazing new movement, the maker movement, hacker spaces. What I discovered was that some technological changes had been occurring, the development of technologies like 3D printing and numerically controlled machinery that was being downsized to desktop size, laser cutters. There was a movement out there of people who said that the way that things are being made in the US, the way that things are being made and distributed is really getting away from the human angle in the human labor, in the sense that people have a lot of creativity, a lot of potential if they're just given the tools to use that potential. And so humans in the 21st century are accustomed to having stuff delivered to their door. They're told, well, this is just the way things are. Don't open that computer up, don't open that phone up, don't open that appliance up, you'll break it. And there's a movement called the hacker movement, which people mostly associate with computer software, but it actually turns out to be a very powerful movement in the hardware. People saying, no, that's not true. You can actually take something that's off the shelf, made by some manufacturer in some distant country, open it up, look at its innards, look at how it actually works, and make it better. Hack it, add something to it, redesign it, put another program into its controller. So I began maybe about 6 months ago doing a serious reading on this. I've now been to a couple of these spaces. I've been able to give some presentations on the maker movement. I've actually spent a couple of days learning how to use a CNC machine. I must say, what I produced, my wife simply said to me something like, "Oh, that's a lot better than I thought it would be." Okay, so I'm getting started. My skills are slowly being honed. But what I've discovered is that there's a really interesting possible new industrial revolution occurring. This is what Jerry and I have been talking about. I know Jerry will probably be coming here shortly to tell you about this, which is that the new technologies combined with this new, the maker movement, which is a very powerful global movement to give people back, in a sense, control over their own destiny, to put it in very grandiose terms or more prosaic terms, to make available the tools people can use to make stuff for themselves. And it can be as simple as things that you play with, the things that are functionally useful in the kitchen or the car, the garage, things like this. It's an amazingly adaptable set of technologies. So again, what's important about the way this is developing is that maker spaces, are being put together through contributed resources, through Kickstarter campaigns There are probably over 1,000 of these maker spaces now in the United States and in Western Europe and spreading. And these spaces make available on an inclusive basis this machinery, tools, help, consulting help, make available to people who can just come in and, in some of these cases, pay nothing to use the stuff, or maybe pay for the materials, and get a chance to actually design stuff that will be enriching their own lives. Now, what's interesting to me from an entrepreneurship point of view is that some of these projects people are undertaking do have commercial potential. And the two examples everybody knows about, one of them is the Pebble watch, which was started with a Kickstarter campaign and was hacked. It's a hacking of a bunch of a physical entity, the bracelet, with the little microcontroller inside and the sensors. And that was put together by somebody who didn't go to a venture capitalist, didn't go to an angel investor. He went to Kickstarter, a crowdfunding source, got the money, and put this thing together. Square was the other thing that was put together through one of these campaigns. So the potential is there for people to get more heavily involved in designing the things that make their own lives more enriched, make them better off perhaps in some sense. But it also is there, the potential is there for people, thousands of these people now in these maker spaces working to stumble over stuff that is what some people would call, Sonali Shah and Mary Tripps called user-driven innovation, and Eric von Hippel. Things that people discover, and when they're working with an off-the-shelf design, they realize this could be improved. How do we improve this? Well, now you're not just stuck with your hammer and a screwdriver. You've got a CNC machine, you've got a 3D printer, you've got the computer software design programs that let you do stuff you were unthinkable 15, 20 years ago. And there's the potential there then for some of these things to have legs. Possibly the next revolution is going to be whatever emerges from all these these individual efforts. Imagine, in another way to think about this, if we were stuck in a capitalist society with the R&D labs of big firms, well, we'd be stuck with what the imaginations of those people can generate. And so, in particular, in the hierarchy of these big firms, people are told to work on projects. Well, take the same powerful resources now and downsize them, make them available to people working in these little maker spaces. And instead of having corporate agendas driving the innovation, now you've got users driving the innovation. They're recognizing local needs. Ithaca, New York, may have people who need stuff that people in Binghamton don't need, or Elmira don't need. Or alternatively, this area, Binghamton, Elmira, Cortland, Ithaca, may collectively have needs that we wouldn't have in the Research Triangle Park. Who knows? The maker movement and the possibility that these people will come together and help one another on the ground means that the innovations the variations are being generated that might well succeed in changing the world for those people locally. That's an unprecedented opening to the future. So, as those who know me well have heard me say in the past, I'm an evolutionary theorist, which means it's a violation of my credo if I actually claim clairvoyance and look into the future, right? Because by definition, tomorrow is different than today, but we don't know what the next day will give us and the next day. So let me talk about the near past and the immediate future, perhaps. So one of the things I'd like to say to the grad students watching this is, I know that entrepreneurship used to be an area that people kind of avoided because it wasn't sexy enough. It wasn't like studying big firms and M&As and IPOs. But entrepreneurship actually is an amazingly attractive and interesting field. When you're looking at big firms, look at publicly held firms. There are 5,000 firms in the United States. There are more than 5,000 organizational scientists, right? We could, technically speaking, assign each one of the 5,000 one organization, have them all meet once a year and talk about their organizations, and we're finished. That's not true. With entrepreneurship, there are thousands, millions of trials every year. This is going on all the time, right? There's lots of variation to study. Moreover, if you're trying to do a study of organizational change in a big firm, you have to wait forever for stuff to happen. And getting access to this and a lot of people to follow around. Looking at startups, 2, 3, 4 people, right? Just get a small group. Stuff's going to happen. It's going to happen right there in front of you immediately. People understand what's going on because the totality of what's happening is in your grasp. It's not like trying to study big organizations. Right? So it's a great place it's a great laboratory to study a lot of social processes, networks, power, gender dynamics. All these things are in this micro laboratory of startups. Now, with respect to the methodological challenges I see, a couple of things are going on in the field. Big data is good in many respects because big data is giving us the ability to discover patterns we never knew were there. And I like that. I have a couple of colleagues doing big data. But the danger for a social scientist in using either big data or archival data, which many of my colleagues are using patent data or data that comes from the Census Bureau, or now what's become popular is using data from Sweden and Denmark, these big census projects. The difficulty with that stuff is that you're at arm's length or more from the actual phenomena, right? And so one of my arguments going back to the first papers I wrote in the mid-1980s about entrepreneurship research methods, one of the big problems is we don't have people doing the real field work, the ethnographic field work, the observational field work, going into entrepreneurial startups, new ventures, or into incubators and accelerators for that matter, and actually hanging out, spending days observing, taking notes, recording, doing mini experiments if you're permitted to do so, collecting data in innovative ways. We don't have people doing that. I've been very frustrated recently. I'm trying to recruit people just to say, let's do some entrepreneurship research using ethnography that documents in a typical week or a month what entrepreneurs actually do. How do they spend their time? How much time are they spending in meetings? Are these people like Mintzberg's managers in the nature of entrepreneurial work, where their day is consumed with meetings? They actually spend very little time thinking about strategy. They're mostly stuck with answering memos and answering the phone and giving people orders. What's the real deal with entrepreneurs? We have these great magazine articles in magazines like Wired and Fast Company. The world they describe is a very different world than the world that you read about in the corporate novels, books about corporate venturing, right? So I'm encouraging people to consider. Not everybody should do this, right? But there are some people out there who probably are naturally gifted ethnographers. They're really good at watching people do stuff and interpreting what they're seeing, writing down what they're seeing in a way that they can communicate to others the value of what is going on. So I'm really hopeful that if you're interested in entrepreneurship, interested in organizations more generally, that before you begin using an archival data set, the data set handed to you by somebody, a data set you download from the web, from the ICPSR, you actually go out and spend a little time with the phenomena. I'm constantly amazed when I go to professional meetings, the Academy of Management in particular. I meet with people, we do the doctoral consortium, so I talk to students about their proposals. I'll ask them questions about the phenomena. I'll say, well, okay, you're studying gamers, people making gaming software. Tell me, what's it like to be in one of the shops where they're putting this together? And I say, well, I don't know, I've never actually watched them do this. Or I said, what's it like to be in a biotech firm? What's it like in the lab? What's the interaction like between the scientists and the entrepreneurs? I don't know, I've never seen it. So I'm constantly struck, but I ask them questions about basic descriptive characteristics of the phenomena, and they can't tell me this. They tell me what they read in books. They tell me the code book, what the variables are in the code book. That's not enough, right? If you're going to convince me that you understand the phenomena, I want to know from you, I want a report from the field. And so I'm encouraging some of you out there, a few of you who are listening to this, who have the resources to maybe stay in graduate school an extra year, or have a mentor who's really interested in helping you with this. Try this out. Let's get some reports from the field, perhaps transform our understanding of the entrepreneurial startup process.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.